August 19th, 1944. The atmosphere inside the Wehrmacht headquarters in East Prussia was suffocating, thick with the smoke of cigarettes and the unspoken dread of impending calamity. General Alfred Jodl, the chief of the operations staff of the Armed Forces High Command, stood over a sprawling map table, reviewing the latest intelligence reports streaming in from the crumbling front lines of France. To the untrained eye, the situation was merely bad. To Jodl's expert gaze, the numbers looked absolutely catastrophic for the Americans. General George S. Patton's Third Army was moving with a ferocity that defied conventional military wisdom. They had advanced an astonishing 400 miles in a mere 30 days, a blitzkrieg pace that rivaled the Germans' own early successes. Patton's spearhead divisions were racing toward the German border, seemingly unstoppable. However, Jodl's staff, comprised of the finest mathematical minds in the German military, had done the calculations, and the conclusion was inescapable. There was a hard limit to this advance, a mathematical wall that Patton was about to hit at full speed. The Americans have outrun their logistics, Jodl told his operations staff with the icy confidence of a man who believes in the absolute certainty of numbers. The advance is bound to be checked by the friction of its own weight. His reasoning was sound, rooted in centuries of military history. No army in the history of warfare had ever sustained such breakneck speeds without a continuous supply of fuel. The laws of physics cannot be violated, not even by Americans. An armored division was a voracious beast, consuming 150,000 gallons of fuel every single day when advancing. Patton commanded not one, but 12 divisions spread across a massive 60-mile front. The supply depots, crucial lifelines for this mechanical juggernaut, were languishing 400 miles behind at the Normandy beaches. Jodl's calculations were methodical, precise, and cold. Patton needed 12,000 tons of supplies daily just to exist, let alone fight. The French road network, shattered by years of war and Allied bombing, simply couldn't support that volume. Furthermore, the Wehrmacht had systematically destroyed bridges and rail lines during their retreat, a scorched earth policy designed to strangle any pursuit. The German General Staff predicted, with near religious certainty, that the Third Army would grind to a screeching halt at the Seine River. This predicted pause was the lifeline Germany needed. It would give Wehrmacht forces the critical time to regroup, establish hardened defensive positions, and perhaps hold the line through the winter. If they could stall Patton until the snows came, the war might be prolonged indefinitely. The mathematics were irrefutable. It was a logic of supply and demand that had governed warfare since the Romans. But what Jodl didn't know, what he couldn't possibly comprehend from his bunker in East Prussia, was that American logistics officers were already planning something unprecedented. They were devising a solution that ignored the rulebook entirely. It was a continuous convoy system that would defy every principle of German military doctrine, prioritizing speed and volume over safety and efficiency. It was an operation so audacious, so chaotic, and so distinctly American that within 6 days it would be fully operational. The Red Ball Express would begin on August 25th. Within days of its launch, Patton's supposedly immobilized tanks, which Jodl believed would be sitting dry and useless, would crash through German positions at the Seine with full fuel tanks. The Wehrmacht's finest military minds were about to receive a brutal lesson in American logistics that would shatter their understanding of modern warfare forever. The German General Staff's confidence was not born of arrogance alone, but of brutal experience. They were the architects of blitzkrieg. They understood intimately how logistics killed offensives because they had suffered it themselves. Their own campaigns had repeatedly stalled when supply lines collapsed under the strain of rapid advancement. In the vast expanses of Russia, the Wehrmacht's advance had foundered not from Soviet resistance initially, but from the sheer inability to supply forces across such vast distances. German trucks, engineered for the paved roads of Western Europe, broke down in the thick Russian mud. Horse-drawn wagons, which still incredibly made up 80% of German military transport, couldn't match the speed of the panzer divisions. Railway gauge differences meant supplies piled up hundreds of miles from the fighting units, requiring laborious transfers. Entire divisions sat immobilized in the freezing cold, waiting for fuel that never arrived, watching their mechanical advantage turn into a frozen tomb. The Germans had learned this lesson in blood and frozen remains. You cannot fight further than your trucks can drive. General Heinrich von Luttwitz, commanding the 47th Panzer Corps, looked at the map of France and understood that American forces faced the same logistical impossibility Germany had faced in Russia. Their mechanical advantage becomes a disadvantage, he reasoned. Machines require fuel, ammunition, parts. The more machines you have, the tether to your supply base becomes shorter. History teaches us what comes next. German intelligence meticulously tracked American consumption rates, waiting for the inevitable collapse. They knew that a Sherman tank burned half a mile per gallon on roads, and the fuel economy was far worse cross-country. They knew an infantry division required 700 tons of supplies daily, and an armored division needed a staggering 1,000 tons. General Siegfried Westphal, Chief of Staff to Field Marshal von Rundstedt, assessed the situation on August 20th with grim satisfaction. The supply situation of the enemy was calculated to be impossible, he wrote. The Germans expected a total halt. They prepared for it, but the halt never came. August 25th, 1944. The scene shifted to a requisitioned French chateau near Laval. The air was tense. Colonel Charles Thrasher, commanding the advanced section of the communications zone, stood before a room full of skeptical officers. He had an impossible proposal to sell. The reality on the ground was dire. Patton's Third Army was consuming supplies faster than any army in human history. Traditional supply methods had collapsed completely under the strain. Railway transport, the backbone of military logistics, couldn't keep pace due to track destruction. Scheduled convoys were backing up at depots, creating massive bottlenecks. The entire logistics system was breaking down, threatening to leave Patton's army stranded in enemy territory. Thrasher took a breath and announced the plan. They were going to create a one-way highway loop from the beaches to the front lines. It would be a conveyor belt of steel and rubber. Every vehicle would run 20 hours out of 24. There would be no stopping except for gas and genuine emergencies. The initial goal was to move 4,500 tons of supplies daily, a minimum threshold to keep the offensive alive. The technical specifications of the plan defied every principle of military logistics and safety. Thrasher proposed two parallel one-way highways, one exclusively for loaded trucks heading forward, and one for empty trucks returning to the depots. It was to be a closed loop. Operations would run 24 hours a day. Most shockingly, they would drive with headlights blazing at night, abandoning blackout discipline completely. In a war zone dominated by the threat of air attack and artillery, this was tantamount to suicide. Convoys were to move at 5-minute intervals, maintaining a 35 miles per hour average speed. Mobile maintenance units would be stationed every 50 miles to handle breakdowns. Military police checkpoints would ruthlessly remove any vehicle moving below 25 miles per hour. The rule was draconian. Any truck that couldn't be fixed in 15 minutes would be pushed off the road and abandoned. The mission was more important than the vehicle. Lieutenant Colonel Gordon Ayers of the Motor Transport Service reviewed the vehicle requirements with Thrasher, and the numbers were staggering. They needed 140 truck companies. They needed 5,958 vehicles, minimum, operating at 90% availability. In the world of mechanical engineering, maintaining 90% availability for heavy trucks running 20 hours a day was a fantasy. It was impossible by any logistics textbook ever written. Yet, within 36 hours, the impossible was operational. The name of the operation came from railway terminology, a nod to the industrial roots of the plan. A Red Ball freight was an express shipment that took priority over everything else on the line. The Red Ball Express would operate on the same principle. Nothing stopped the Red Ball. On August 26, 1944, the engines roared to life. Drivers from the 3,916th Quartermaster Truck Company climbed into their GMC CCKW trucks. The Deuce and a Half. Soldiers called them 2.5-ton 6x6 workhorses that would become the icon of the operation. They were loaded to the brim with ammunition bound for Patton's hungry guns 300 miles to the east. But there was another layer to this story, one of profound social complexity. Of the 23,000 drivers who would operate the Red Ball Express, approximately 75% were African American soldiers. They served in a United States Army that was still strictly segregated. These were men who wore the uniform of their country, but were not allowed to eat in white restaurants or use white facilities in much of America. They were fighting a war against Aryan supremacy in Europe, while living under Jim Crow laws at home. These men, who faced discrimination and prejudice from their own countrymen, were now the sole lifeline keeping the most celebrated white general's army in motion. The irony was lost on no one, least of all the drivers. They were delivering the keys to a freedom they were still waiting to hold in their own hands. Every gear shifted, every mile conquered, was a silent argument for their own citizenship and worth. The drivers developed their own culture immediately, a distinct identity born of pride and exhaustion. They painted slogans on the sides of their trucks: Patton's Blood Bank, Hitler Here We Come, Detroit to Berlin Express. The trucks became their identity, their homes, and their weapons. They created their own traffic rules that violated every military regulation in the book. Slower vehicles were bullied off the road immediately. Mechanical failures were pushed into ditches without ceremony or paperwork. Any truck moving below 20 miles per hour was considered a roadblock to be eliminated. The physical toll was immense. The drivers worked in teams, driving for 20 hours with only 4 hours of sleep. They lived on adrenaline and caffeine. They took military-issued stimulants, Benzedrine, to stay awake as the white lines on the road began to blur. They drank coffee by the gallon. They drove through levels of exhaustion that would have hospitalized most men. They hallucinated from sleep deprivation, seeing phantom obstacles in the road, yet they kept their feet on the gas. Within 48 hours, they had established a rhythm that would continue for 82 days without pause. The Red Ball Express was rolling, a river of steel flowing across France, and German intelligence was about to start filing reports that made absolutely no sense to the high command. August 28, 1944. German reconnaissance units overlooking the main Red Ball route began reporting something unprecedented. The reports coming back to headquarters seemed impossible, perhaps the result of hysteria. They described a continuous vehicle column, with headlights visible for 20 kilometers, stretching like a snake of fire across the landscape. There was no spacing between vehicles. There was no blackout discipline. Officers from Aufklärungs 116 radioed estimates of 1,000 vehicles per hour passing their observation posts. The Americans had abandoned all military precaution. This violated everything German military doctrine taught about logistics operations. You do not drive with lights on. You do not bunch up trucks. You do not expose your supply lines. To a German soldier shivering in a dark foxhole, that distant, unending vibration wasn't just noise. It was the sound of an industrial giant that didn't need to sleep and didn't care if they did. It was the sound of inevitable defeat. General Edgar Feuchtinger, commanding the 21st Panzer Division, personally observed the Red Ball Express from concealed positions on August 30th. He needed to see it to believe it. What he saw confirmed what every frontline soldier already knew in their gut. His report to Army Group B headquarters reflected a growing sense of alarm and helplessness. The speed of your buildup and the Red Ball was something beyond our comprehension, Feuchtinger reported. Vehicles pass at 30-second intervals, day and night, without pause. They don't hide, don't disperse, don't follow any rules we understand. What the Germans couldn't understand was that American logistics operated on completely different philosophical principles. Where German doctrine emphasized concealment and conservation, Americans relied on overwhelming volume and speed. Where Germans conserved vehicles because they couldn't replace them, Americans assumed a 20% mechanical failure rate and simply planned accordingly, treating trucks as disposable ammunition. Where Germans followed strict military procedure with everything scheduled and authorized by officers, Americans improvised continuously. Individual truck drivers made decisions on the fly that in the Wehrmacht would require field marshal approval. The cultural difference was incomprehensible to the rigid German officer corps. In the first week alone, from August 25th to 31st, the Red Ball Express delivered 89,939 tons of supplies. The round-trip distance covered by each convoy was 686 miles. The performance exceeded every prediction. Headquarters had set an initial goal of 4,500 tons daily. The drivers were delivering nearly 3 times that amount. Patton's Third Army never slowed down for lack of supplies. By September 5th, the cumulative tonnage reached 135,000 tons delivered. The convoy system was moving more supplies by truck than the entire Wehrmacht in France received through their rail network. German intelligence officers stared at the data and couldn't believe the reports. Vehicle availability averaged 92% despite predictions of 70%. The drivers were keeping trucks running through mechanical failure, sleep deprivation, and weather that should have stopped operations cold. The maintenance crews were performing miracles daily. German staff officers calculated that at this delivery rate, American forces could sustain offensive operations indefinitely. The prediction of an imminent halt, the foundation of their defensive strategy, had been catastrophically wrong. Patton wasn't halting, he was accelerating. Reports from the front became increasingly desperate. Third Army had crossed the Seine on August 25th, exactly when German calculations said they would run dry. They liberated Reims on August 30th. They seized bridgeheads at Verdun on August 31st. The Red Ball Express was sustaining an advance that German military science had declared physically impossible, and the operation was just getting started. But to understand how this impossible machine was built, one must look back at the man who had been obsessed with this problem since 1918. The Germans had overlooked who was actually coordinating American logistics at the strategic level: General George C. Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, was one of the most brilliant logistical minds the U.S. military ever produced, and he had been planning for this moment for decades. During World War I, Colonel Marshall had orchestrated a logistics miracle. He discreetly moved over 600,000 men and 93,000 horses to execute the Meuse-Argonne offensive in 1918. He coordinated these massive troop and supply transfers right under German noses, primarily at night, in just 14 days. Marshall's personal experience in World War I logistics became the doctrine for World War II planning. The Red Ball Express used principles he had developed 25 years earlier: continuous flow, redundancy, and the willingness to accept waste to maintain speed. In the 1930s, Marshall completely reinvented U.S. military doctrine at Fort Benning. That was where he trained most of the officers who would lead in Europe. He kept mental notes on every promising junior officer he encountered. On September 1st, 1939, the day Germany invaded Poland, Marshall became Chief of Staff. At that time, Eisenhower was still a lieutenant colonel, but Marshall already had him on his short list for high command. Marshall ruthlessly gutted the General Officer Corps between 1939 and 1941. He forced Deadwood generals into retirement men who were mentally stuck in the trench warfare of the past, some of whom had last fought in the Spanish-American War. He elevated new officers with entirely different qualifications, men who understood mobility and industry. Marshall trained them, evaluated them, and chosen them personally. Every great general the Americans fielded, Patton included, had been selected and mentored by Marshall. The Red Ball Express was Marshall's vision executed by Marshall's students. The actual architect of the Red Ball Express on the ground was General John C. H. Lee, Quartermaster Chief for the European Theater. Soldiers called him Jesus Christ himself, Lee. The nickname wasn't affectionate. Lee was Bible-thumping, arrogant, and egotistical. After Paris was liberated, he immediately moved his massive logistics headquarters into the luxurious Hotel Majestic, while combat troops slept in muddy foxholes. This decision created massive friction with Eisenhower and Patton. Officers despised him. Enlisted men hated him. But Lee had one redeeming quality. He got supplies moving. He coordinated the supply trains that followed troops from D-Day beaches to Paris and beyond. He made the impossible operational through sheer force of will and organizational genius. Lee had been in logistics his entire career. He understood a fundamental truth that combat generals often forgot. War was won by tonnage delivered, not battles fought. Everything else was theater. Logistics was reality. When Patton demanded fuel, Lee found ways around the bureaucracy. When ammunition ran low, Lee prioritized it above food. When winter clothing was needed, Lee delivered it. He didn't care if generals liked him. He cared about tons per mile per day. Lee's staff worked 20-hour days matching Patton's advance. They positioned fuel dumps 50 miles ahead of Third Army. They staged ammunition at crossroads Patton would reach in 3 days. They anticipated requirements before combat commanders even requested them. The Red Ball Express was Lee's masterpiece. Wasteful, inefficient, brutal on men and machines, but undeniably effective. In war, Lee believed working mattered more than elegance. Mobile maintenance units positioned every 50 miles performed miracles of mechanical improvisation. They swapped engines in 45 minutes using mobile cranes in the mud. German mechanics, lacking parts and tools, required 2 days for the same job in a workshop. When trucks broke down on the Red Ball route, recovery teams descended immediately. Under the ironclad rule established at Laval, There was no time for repairs on the road. If the truck couldn't be running in 15 minutes, it was stripped of its parts like a carcass and pushed off the road. The drivers didn't just lose a vehicle, they lost their only home. But the mathematics of the red ball had no room for sentiment. Only tonnage mattered. As the seasons changed, winter presented new, deadly challenges. November brought freezing rain and snow. The trucks, designed for general utility, wouldn't start in sub-zero temperatures. Midwestern drivers from Wisconsin and Minnesota stepped up, showing everyone winter solutions learned on the farm. They drained oil while engines were still warm, heated it over open fires, and poured it back hot to get engines started. They wrapped batteries in blankets and rotated them through heated tents. They mixed alcohol into fuel to prevent lines from freezing. Tire failures happened constantly. The roads were rough, loads were overweight, and speeds were excessive. The Red Ball Express wore out 180,000 tires in 82 days. Supply depots kept mountains of replacement tires staged at intervals. Drivers became expert mechanics by necessity. They learned to diagnose problems by sound, repair fuel pumps with improvised tools, and patch radiators with whatever materials were available. Every driver carried his own toolkit and knew how to use it. The technical achievement wasn't the trucks themselves. The GMC CCKW trucks were reliable, yes, but not exceptional pieces of engineering. The achievement was keeping 6,000 of them operational, simultaneously for nearly 3 months under impossible conditions. German soldiers in defensive positions learned to dread nightfall. That was when they could hear the American trucks most clearly. The sound of thousands of engines rumbling through the darkness never stopped. It was the hum of an empire that would not rest. Wehrmacht veterans described the psychological impact in post-war interviews with a shudder. They could hear the convoys 10 kilometers away. The sound continued all night, every night. It was relentless and terrifying. It was a mechanical heartbeat that never slowed. German troops knew exactly what the sound meant. It meant more ammunition for American artillery to rain down on them. It meant more fuel for American tanks to overrun them. It meant more food for American soldiers who were already well fed. The endless supplies meant the Americans could sustain attacks indefinitely. Captured German soldiers told interrogators they could estimate the timing of American offensives simply by listening to the volume of truck traffic. When the convoys increased, they knew attacks were coming, but knowing didn't help. They couldn't stop the supplies. The headlights, visible from German positions, added to the psychological effect. Those headlights were a glowing ribbon of defiance, cutting across France. It was the arrogance of abundance, telling the Luftwaffe and every German soldier watching, "We are here, and you cannot stop us all." German artillery occasionally shelled the routes, but destroying one truck meant nothing when 5,000 more followed immediately behind it. The Americans simply pushed destroyed vehicles aside and kept rolling. The Wehrmacht couldn't interdict what they couldn't stop. Luftwaffe pilots who attempted to strafe the convoys found themselves facing overwhelming Allied air superiority. American P-47 seconds and P-51 seconds patrolled the routes continuously. German planes that attacked the Red Ball Express rarely returned to base. By September 1944, the Third Army crossed the Seine exactly when German calculations said they would run dry. They didn't slow down, they accelerated. The Red Ball Express kept them fueled and advancing. The cities the Germans swore would hold, the bastions of the Meuse and the Marne, were bypassed or broken in hours. Patton crossed the Moselle River on September 5th. Every prediction of American logistical collapse proved wrong. German forces attempted to establish defensive lines, but the Third Army smashed through them before they could be fortified. The Wehrmacht was retreating faster than they could destroy infrastructure. Patton was exploiting that chaos. By mid-September, the Third Army stood at the German border 400 miles from the Normandy beaches in 6 weeks. The Red Ball Express had delivered every gallon of fuel, every artillery shell, every ration required for this feat. Patton's advance was the fastest of any army in the European theater. British and Canadian forces to the north moved carefully and methodically, tethered to their supply lines. Patton moved like lightning because his logistics allowed it. The German prediction of imminent halt due to logistics had been wrong by months. Third Army never stopped for lack of supplies during the Red Ball Express's operational period. The trucks kept rolling, and the army kept advancing. Only when Eisenhower made the controversial strategic decision to divert fuel to Montgomery's Market Garden operation in mid-September, combined with increased German resistance at the Moselle River and the West Wall defenses, did Patton finally halt. It was not from a failure of the Red Ball, but from strategic decisions at the highest level and stiffening enemy opposition. The Red Ball Express was brutally wasteful by any conventional logistics standard. Over 5,000 trucks were destroyed or abandoned during 82 days of operations. Each one had been someone's home on the road, stripped and discarded when it could no longer serve the mission. The attrition rate horrified traditional quartermaster officers who were used to peacetime accounting. 57 million gallons of fuel were consumed, much of it burned by the delivery trucks hauling fuel itself. The inefficiency was staggering, but the results justified everything. The Third Army advanced 400 miles and liberated most of France. 180,000 tires were worn out, leaving mountains of rubber in French ditches. Replacement costs ran into the millions. The accountants calculated waste. The generals calculated German divisions destroyed. Drivers suffered casualty rates comparable to some combat units. Exhaustion caused fatal accidents. Enemy artillery caught convoys on exposed routes. Mechanical failure killed men when brakes failed on steep hills or trucks rolled over. The human cost was 23,000 men pushed to the very edge of physical collapse for nearly 3 months. 20-hour shifts became routine. Stimulant use was widespread. Sleep deprivation became a way of life. Maintenance crews worked until they dropped. Mobile repair units operated around the clock. The entire logistics network ran on willpower and determination more than proper military planning. By November, when railways were partially restored and the Red Ball Express officially ended, the operation had cost $100 million. It was wasteful and expensive, but it had shortened the war by an estimated 6 months. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B facing Patton's advance, was among Germany's most capable defensive commanders. By October 1944, he understood what Germany was truly facing. Model told his staff they weren't fighting an American army in the traditional sense. They were fighting American industrial capacity itself. The Red Ball Express demonstrated that the United States had mobilized its entire society for war production. German divisions fought brilliantly, with dwindling resources. American divisions fought adequately, but with unlimited everything. Model knew which side would win that equation. It was simply mathematics. In post-war assessments, Model's staff reported that when they finally understood the sheer scale of American logistics capacity, it was clear that the war was lost. The Americans could supply armies faster than Germany could destroy them. The Red Ball Express was a weapon against which they had no defense. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, among Germany's most competent commanders, was asked after the war what most surprised him about American forces. "Not your tanks," he said. "Not your planes, but your trucks. They were the deciding factor." General Heinrich von Luttwitz would later testify about how the Americans defeated Germany. "You piled up the supplies and then let them fall on us," he said. The contrast between Germans living off the land in Russia versus the American industrial supply chain was absolute. German generals who had calculated American logistics would collapse were surrendering by May to armies supplied by those same impossible systems. The predictions that had comforted them in August haunted them in defeat. On November 16, 1944, the Red Ball Express was officially discontinued after 82 days of continuous operation. Railway lines had been partially restored, and pipelines were being laid. The emergency was over. The massive operation disappeared in 72 hours. 23,000 men were reassigned. 6,000 vehicles were redistributed to other units. Routes returned to civilian use. The speed of dissolution matched the speed of creation. Final statistics told the story of a logistical miracle. Total cargo delivered 412,193 tons. Total distance covered 122 million ton-miles. Operating days 82. The numbers represented the moment warfare changed forever. The Red Ball Express proved that industrial capacity mattered more than tactical brilliance. It proved that logistics determined strategy rather than serving it. It proved that the side with the most trucks beat the side with the best tactics. The operations methods became permanent American military doctrine. Continuous high-volume supply and the willingness to accept waste for effectiveness became the standard approach. Every logistics operation since has borrowed from Red Ball principles. In 1994, the United States Postal Service issued a commemorative stamp honoring the operation. Veterans attended ceremonies at the National Postal Museum. They spoke of pride in proving that American determination could overcome any obstacle. The Red Ball Express ended, but its impact echoed through military history. German generals, who calculated Patton's advance was logistically impossible, learned the hardest lesson of modern warfare. Industrial democracy mobilized resources on a scale that totalitarian efficiency couldn't match. They had assumed Americans would follow European precedent: conservative logistics, careful resource management, and methodical advancement. Instead, Americans created a logistics system that overwhelmed German forces through sheer abundance and audacity. 23,000 truck drivers achieved what German military science declared impossible. They supplied advancing armies faster than physics should allow. They maintained a tempo beyond human endurance. In his memoirs, Patton wrote that the truck drivers of the Red Ball Express deserved as much credit for defeating Germany as any combat unit. They were black soldiers mostly, segregated and discriminated against by the very country they served. But they won the war as surely as any rifleman on the line. The highways of France still bear scars from the Red Ball Express, but the greatest monument to their effort is the speed of Allied victory. Every day the war was shortened, saved thousands of lives in the camps and on the battlefields. The lesson stands clear across history. In industrial warfare, victory belongs to the nation that delivers the most supplies, fastest, and farthest. The German calculations had accounted for everything: fuel consumption, distance, road capacity, except the American capacity for total industrial mobilization delivered at 35 miles per hour by the greatest logistics operation in history.